Hey everybody, how you doing? Steve Martirano here. A moment before we get into the nitty gritty here. Now, I got to remind you again. You will have our eternal gratitude if you just click that subscription button. We need your support in that fashion. Hit the button, subscribe. We'll love you long time here on the Behavioral Corner. Hi and welcome. I'm Steve Martirano, and this is the Behavioral Corner. You're invited to hang with us as we discuss the ways we live today, the choices we make, the things we do, and how they affect our health and well-being. So you're on the corner, the Behavioral Corner. Please hang around a while. What is today? May 12th, 2022, 3, 2, 1. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Behavioral Corner. Here I am again, hanging out. Steve Martirano. What do we do on the corner? Well, we wait for really interesting people to bump into us, and they share their stories with us. We hope you're finding that to be the case, because we certainly enjoy the people we run into on the Behavioral Corner. It's all underwritten by our partners, Retreat Behavioral Health. You'll hear more about them later on. I'm really excited about today for a number of reasons. But as I prepare for the interview with our guest, it began to occur to me that what we were going to talk about today is really a detective story. It's really a detective story. And the crimes, if you will allow me, that are under investigation in this book don't occur in the library, and they weren't committed by Colonel Mustard. But instead, the events we're going to talk about, the crimes, as I call it, occur in our brains, in our heads. It's an amazing story told by our guest, who has described the brain very early on in her book as the most complex machine known to mankind. I hear that. Our guest is Sara Manning Peskin, right?
Exactly.
Peskin? Yes. Sara is the author of a book called A Molecule Away from Madness, The Hijacking of Our Brain. And it is a dandy read, I'm telling you, friends. Sara is very accomplished. She's a medical doctor. She's an assistant professor of clinical neurology at the University of Pennsylvania. She got her undergrad degree at Harvard. Then she moved to Philadelphia. Good move. Attended medical school, got her master's degree in cellular and molecular biology at the University of Pennsylvania. And did I mention she is also a professor of clinical neurology at that university? So, Sara, thanks for joining us, and welcome to the Behavioral Corner.
Thanks so much for having me, Steve.
So it is kind of, by the way, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that this book can be scary as you're reading it, the conclusion of which is hopeful, because we're learning more and more. But boy, there's some stories here that made me sit up and go, wow, this is crazy. The Hijacking of the Brain. What a wonderful title for the book. Before we get to the nitty gritty of what you're describing here about the our nervous system, what attracted you to the field of neurology in the first place?
I think I was always interested in cases in medical school where you go in and meet someone and their sort of identity has been changed. There are diseases of the brain, there are diseases of the liver that can alter someone's cognition. You can have heart disease and it can cause some changes in cognition, but when you have essential brain diseases, they really change someone's selfhood. And I think there's this idea that we go through life with, where it's like, my gallbladder might go, my kidneys might go, but I'm still myself. I am my identity. And we don't really realize that actually our entire identities are still actually sort of hanging tenuously from a single organ that can self-destruct the same way as all of our other organs can do that.
And it's surprisingly, given its complexity, that it doesn't do it more often. I mean, kidneys and heart and lungs seem to fail at a greater rate than our brain, which is, I suppose, good news and bad news. It's an amazing story, and you tell it so brilliantly. So it's so accessible. You tell it, but basically through these stories of people that have undergone these just horrible transformations. Why did you choose that? I think I know you wanted to personalize it and give us a story about it. But is that why you did it? You were drawn to the personal story?
Yeah, initially, when I first started writing about the book, actually, initially I wasn't going to write anything about sort of medical history. I was just going to write about patient stories. And I sort of, a lot of these diseases are sort of wild and out there. And I used to come home and my husband, who's not in medicine, would say, like, how do people not know about this? These stories are so outlandish. So initially the idea was just, share the stories that I, talk about when I get home. And then when I went actually to write about them, I realized, on one level you could say, okay, here's this person going along in their life and something happens to them and surprise, this is the disease. But that doesn't really make it that accessible. And then I realized what I needed to do actually was tell the story of the disease as a narrative.
Yeah.
And that's what I ended up with. It's sort of the story of patients and then also the story of the diseases that they have and how most of the diseases that I write about actually are treatable and a lot of them are curable. And ultimately, as you hopefully felt, the goal is to strike a hopeful tone and to say, look, there are so many things that go wrong, but actually, when you look around, most of us are doing pretty damn well.
Yeah. Well, as I said at the outset here, it's a miracle that, we get up in the morning, put our shoes on and, remember where the refrigerator is. It's these are stories that are unbelievable. It's particularly powerful when you tell it from the perspective of individuals that you have either seen or heard about, because this is a difficult topic for a lay person. I mean, the nervous system is everything. The brain is, as you say, incredibly complex. To discuss it from a purely technical way, I think would lose people. But when you take what's ever going on with them and show us what happens to their personality, their behavior, their life, then you go, I got to start paying attention to this. It's extraordinary. I remember the first time I really understood what can happen to your cognition with that syndrome where people believe their loved ones or acquaintances are not them. It's an imposter.
Imposters. Yeah, Kafka's delusions. Yeah, they're wild. And they're just they're horribly traumatic. It's often directed at a spouse. And it's just horribly traumatic for spouses.
Yeah, that was the first time years ago when I read about that. I thought of that movie, The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where people keep going around, no, that's not my husband. What are you talking about? Is your husband? And I'm thinking, well, actually, there are people that have this problem. Anyway, all of this is caused by the malfunction of our brains. I guess in terms of brain disease or disorder, the most common one, the one that's most available to people on a mainstream basis, is dementia in general, and Alzheimer's, of course. Tell us about that. Those things.
The most common question we get in clinic is, what's the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's disease? Mm-hmm. And so dementia really just describes what it looks like when someone moves about the world. It describes someone who can't do what's called particularly complex things, like they can't do, driving, grocery shopping, cooking, because of memory and thinking problems and because of a problem that's progressive. Alzheimer's disease describes what's going on under a microscope. Yeah. So when I give someone a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, what I tell them is, what I'm really saying is, if I took a piece of your brain out and I looked at it under a microscope, this is what I think I would see. And I actually tell them about the story of the original Dr. Alzheimer, which I wrote about in the book, who is this, he was this German neuropsychiatrist in the early 1900s. And he actually was sort of a boisterous guy. He had written his PhD on the cellular life of earwax, but he'd also gotten a citation for disturbing the peace in training. So he was this sort of very social and super smart guy. And he is working in this asylum in Frankfurt, and he meets this 51-year-old woman named August Dieter. And she's been dropped off by her husband because her husband's like, I can't manage her at home anymore. She's gone crazy. And he starts studying her and realizes that she's had this profound loss of memory. So he can go talk with her. He can show her objects, and at least initially she can name them. She knows what they are. And then he shows up a few minutes later and she has no concept that he was just there. And he asks her to write her name, and she writes Mrs. August, and then she writes Mrs., I think, and then she forgets what the task is. And he's interested. So he follows her for a time at this asylum. And then he actually ends up moving away after a little bit less than 2 years, but he basically calls dibs on her brain. So everyone knows that like when this patient dies, they have to call Dr. Alzheimer in Munich and let him know. And so she passes away and they call him up and they say, like, you want us to send you her brain. So this is like a totally different system of sharing medical information than now. And he says, sure, send it over. They send over her brain in a box along with her entire medical record. They send it over to Munich, and Alzheimer ends up taking pieces of the brain, slicing them up, and he looks under a microscope and he sees these two structures. One of them looks sort of like under a microscope, looks sort of like a spray painted spot. And we know now that's made of a protein called amyloid. And the other looks sort of like spaghetti inside of neurons. And we know now that's made of a protein called tau. And it's that when we say someone has Alzheimer's disease, we mean under a microscope, we think they have amyloid and tau. That's what it means. And Alzheimer himself, it turns out, makes this finding and decides, maybe I've discovered a new disease, goes to this meeting and presents it, and nobody cares at all. There's complete silence in the audience, and the moderator says, well, it seems like there's no desire for discussion. Please have a seat.
Why do you suppose that was? Why were they? Was it so startling and so novel that it didn't resonate?
I think that so people had known about these structures before in older people in senile dementia. Mm-hmm. What Alzheimer's point was, we used to think these were just random structures you'd see in senile dementia, but in this young patient, maybe these are pathologic. These are causing the problem. And I think it was sort of so outlandish that people didn't seem to believe it. Later in the same conference, actually, there's a presentation about excessive masturbation, and people love that presentation. There's like incredible conversation. It's the highlight of the meeting. And here, this guy has just discovered this disease that's going to affect millions and millions of people, and nobody cares at all.
Well, it helps to know your audience.
Exactly. Maybe he should have chosen a different meeting.
It helps to know what they all have in common. It's interesting you mentioned that his startling discovery 100 years ago. Did you say how long ago?
Yeah, it was in 1900. I want to say it was 1906 that he gave the presentation, and 1909 that the term Alzheimer's disease ultimately is sort of coined.
Lots of the discoveries vis-a-vis how the brain works and what's going on were almost always, not always, but very often ignored, and then later on, another inquiry would put on top of that, and then we begin to get a better picture. When did that process begin for real? Because the things you describe in the book, the personality disruptions, the violence, the strange behavior, historically, were just assigned to Bedlam. These people were lunatics. When did we begin to go, wait a minute, there's something else going on here?
Yeah, it's actually interesting that you use the term bedlam as part of the research in the book. One thing that came up is that the term bedlam is actually from Bethlehem Hospital in London, mm-hmm. Which maybe that's common knowledge. I hadn't known it before, yeah, it's
I know the Boris Karloff movie, so that's why.
So it's interesting. When did we get that shift? I mean, in some ways, we're still doing the same shift. I imagine 20 years from now, there's people who are sitting in inpatient psych facilities who otherwise, 20 years from now, they would be on a neurology floor getting treated, but we don't yet know what they have. Mm-hmm. And you could say, one of the diseases I write about in the book is caused this woman who she was highly successful, and she essentially very quickly started thinking that she was living in The Walking Dead in the show, and she became acutely psychotic. And 30 years ago, she 100% would have been admitted to a psych facility, and that would have been it. She probably would never have gone back to normal. Yeah, and now she's treated.
That was your first story. It was. It sounds like the plot of a novel or a movie. She thought she was in a zombie apocalypse and grew violent over it and uncontrollable. Immediately, they must think she's having a psychotic episode, or they thought she was on angel dust, right?
Exactly. Thought she was on PCP, and actually, the disease works the same as PCP, except that if you take PCP, it wears off eventually, but the disease doesn't wear off unless you treat it.
What other behaviors are altered by a neurological problem in the brain? You describe so many. Give me another couple of examples.
So there are some that are sort of behavioral sort of outbursts, like psychosis like that. And then some of them are a little bit less sort of aggressive. There are things like, I read about early onset Alzheimer's disease in this family where it's caused by a genetic mutation. And there, the primary symptom is just this incredibly pervasive, severe memory loss in people who are in the middle of their working careers. And then there are some of the conditions cause movement changes, like Huntington's disease causes these sort of writhing dance-like movements, almost like if you imagine an electrical current going through the body, and how that would pick up the limbs. So there's
your story of that woman and her daughter is, some people get more than their share to bear, and she certainly did. The worst part of that for her in Huntington's disease, and tell me how many other of these ailments are also hereditary. That's what she was worried about. Are all these neurological problems of the brain hereditary or no?
It's a great question. So the first section in the book is about diseases that are hereditary, but the other two sections are all, not hereditary. And even if you take something like Alzheimer's disease, a very, very small minority of people will have a single gene causing the disease, where if I look at their genetics, I can see if they have a mutation. I can say you're essentially 100% going to get the disease. That's extraordinarily rare. With Alzheimer's disease, most cases, people will have, they can have some risk genes. So there are, 30, 50, 60 genes where, depending on the version of the gene, your risk of the disease may be a little higher or a little bit lower. But it's not a single gene, which is surprising to a lot of people.
Yeah. It leads me into diagnoses, because I've been reading about early onset Alzheimer's, which is rare. It's not pervasive, but it's out there. And the article made the point that one of the problems has been misdiagnosing these things. How is the diagnosis done for neurological problems, brain problems? Is it imaging? Is it blood work? How do you do that?
Yeah, so it's a combination. So when someone comes to our clinic, there are sort of a few steps that we do. So the first thing is hearing from the person, but also hearing from a friend or family member that they come with, because that history is often just as important as what the person themselves tells. Because even normal people, we're pretty bad at judging our own cognition. But we all think that we have sort of better processing speed, better dexterity than we do. So a lot of it at the beginning is getting the story. What was the first symptom? How did things change over time? Did it start with a memory problem? Did it start with inappropriate behavior? Did it start with hallucinations? And those early symptoms often are sort of the key to unlocking what's going on. And then we do essentially brain games. And the goal is to figure out which parts of cognition does someone have difficulty with? Do they have a problem with visuospatial function? Do they have a problem with executive function, which is sort of organization and judgment? Do they have a problem with memory? Do they have a problem with language? So we use tests to try to figure out what are they good at and what are they not good at. And that can often point us in the right direction. Yeah,
but they get to you at a very late stage in this thing, right? I mean, it's not like if your back starts bothering you or any or other part of your body, you can generally get out a little ahead of it, say what's going on. By the time some of the people that you write about in the book present, they got a big problem already.
Yes. Yeah, that's totally true. A lot of them have gone, most of them, I would say, especially the young people, at least once they've gone to their primary doctor and said, I think something's wrong. And they've been told, you're totally fine. Stop worrying. Mm-hmm. Then they've gone back and they've been told, this is ADD or depression or, stress or, bad medications or something like that. So most people have some other diagnosis before they get to us.
Yeah. And most of the time it's treated, I guess, with drugs, which may or may not be the right thing to do there. Let's talk about memory loss in younger people. It's often, as I said, misdiagnosed. Well, it's a brain fog and the stresses of your life, and you're trying to do too many things. Is that just sort of a standard narrative for somebody that age when they present that way, to go, well, it can't be this?
So I think that's often what happens, is that sort of standard answer. On the other hand, I could say, how would we not see this coming? But I see people exactly as you said, they're a lot more severe. It's clear that something's wrong. But as primary care doctor, you probably have 100 people, 160-year-olds coming saying, I'm having memory problems. It's really hard to pick out the one that's more significant because these symptoms at the beginning are really subtle.
That's why it's important to bring someone in with them to talk about what's going on, because they're sort of the objective observer to this thing. So what do we know about the causes of is there one cause to these problems, or is it a multitude of things that can go wrong?
We think it's a lot of different things. So there's, dementia itself it's not that useful of a word. It describes what someone is, how they function in the everyday world. But as far as what causes it under a microscope, there's a ton of different causes. Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause. But there are things like frontotemporal dementia, which causes very different symptoms. They're usually. There's Lewy body dementia that causes people to have these well-formed hallucinations. They'll say, why is that person sitting on the end of my bed? Or, why are those people in the yard there when there's no one there?
How would I read that in the book, and why are you staring at that rabbit, I think, or why is the rabbit staring at us? So if you had that experience in your life, that out of nowhere, your wife or husband says to you, why is that person in our room? What should your reaction to that be? Because maybe they're dreaming, you're dreaming, go back to bed. When do you get alarmed? When do you go, wait a minute, what's going on here?
A lot of people, I think, don't tell anyone at the beginning because they think, I must be crazy.
They let the hallucination just go away and go.
I think a lot of them they keep it to themselves, and then eventually, they tell close people. And I think one interesting with Lewy body disease, actually, the hallucinations tend not to be threatening. So people tend to know that they're not real, but they're very vivid. So it's not the same as, some of the other diseases that I wrote about in the book where the woman who was hallucinating that she was in The Walking Dead, those were scary. She was really scared of it. With Lewy body disease, oftentimes the things that people see, they don't find them scary. They're just, they know they're not there and they're very vivid.
Is it possible, and this would be, I'm sure, wild conjecture on your part, so if you don't want to answer, don't. Is it possible that some of what goes on in the brain that we now view as problematic, before it was diagnosable, and could it account for genius, great creative genius? Wouldn't it be great if you could study Michelangelo's brain to see what was going on? He had the same brain everybody at that period of time had. His worked differently.
Yeah, it's a great question. I have no idea. The only thing that comes to mind is, and I don't know if this is true, but I've always heard the story that the person who designed the Epcot, Epcot Center in Florida, that he had vision problems, and that maybe that accounted for some of it. I don't know if that's true or not. Well, that's what I've always heard.
They used to explain Impressionism that way. Well, they were all nearsighted. They
right.
just couldn't see anything. Our guest is Dr. Manning Peskin. She's a molecular biologist or a neurologist? How do you describe
neurologist? Yeah, I tried to be a molecular biologist, and I quit my PhD. So I think I no longer merit any title like that anymore.
Okay. Well, neurologist is good enough. For those who might not be, have heard the term, neurology is a study of the nervous system, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, what's the nervous system?
So the nervous system is the brain, which you could guess, and then it goes into the spinal cord, and then there's all the nerves that go out to the tips of your fingers, the tips of your toes.
Clearly, there is nothing that we do, from the simplest thing, tying our shoe, or writing a novel or whatever. All is directed by our brain. Is that true?
I would say, but maybe I'm biased because that's why I chose it. Well, there's always that debate between the brain and the heart. Does the heart just exist to pump blood to the brain, or?
Oh, I see. Yeah. Well, and then there's the evidence that it seems like there's no brain activity in some people. So how could that be a factor? Right. But it seems clear to me that we are what's in how our brain is functioning. By the way, this is a question I've always wanted to ask. It's the dumbest question, I'm sure. What's the difference between the mind and the brain?
It's a great question. I don't think there's a good definition. We usually use brain more as sort of an anatomic term.
You do as a physician,
yeah,
right?
but I think that I think more and more people say, like, how could you ever separate that? Anything that happens in the brain is happening in the mind.
Yeah, I wonder whether there was a sharp distinction in your field. No.
There isn't. I will say we don't usually use the term mind. We usually use the term brain. So maybe it's sort of medically speaking, mostly we use the brain term.
Before I forget, what is Fregoli Syndrome? Fregoli, am I pronouncing that right? Do you know what that is?
Fregoli is I have to double check. Isn't that the one where it's like there's two places? You think there's two places? I should know that one. I'd have to look it up.
There's if you guys want to Google some stuff that can be going on in your head, I don't want to scare you, but there's some weird stuff that can happen. I've always felt, and I know you're going to agree, I think, if you look, life is tough. Sometimes things happen to you that you have to overcome one way or another. Organic disease is disease, but it's always occurred to me that if you have cancer or diabetes or whatever it is, your mind is a tremendous tool to help you deal with this. When your mind is having trouble, your liver doesn't help, right? Your lungs don't help. It must terrify people, your patients. It must terrify them to think there's something wrong with their brain.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a really good point, which is when you have a problem with your brain, it's really hard to take care of the rest of your body. So we have, you have people who you have Alzheimer's disease, and then you can't remember to take your medications for your diabetes, and yeah, it really invades everything.
Yeah, and when you lose the ability to think clearly, you can't use the tool that's supposed to allow you to do that. Well, I have this thing. That doesn't work, particularly if your memory is shot. What are the causes of some of that? There are a multitude of causes. Can head injury create these problems, or is it all organic?
So there is an association between a concussion and going on to have neurodegenerative disease, but it's not, at least as far as we know, it's not causative, because there's lots of people who've had concussions who don't go on to have, dementia. And there's lots of people who have dementia who never had a concussion, but there is an association. And ultimately, for most of these cases, we have no idea what causes it. There are some diseases where there's a specific gene, and we can say there's a mutation in your DNA, and that's what causes your problem. But a lot of these, we have no idea why it happens to one person or another.
The advance in this field has been spectacular over the decades, but I think you said at some point, or alluded to the fact that it lags behind other specialties. Oncology, we've made greater strides against cancer than we have against neurological diseases. Is that because of the complexity that we're dealing with?
I think part of it is that it's hard to study these diseases. I mean, how did we do so well in cancer? Right now, if you develop cancer, you go to your doctor, and ideally they take out a piece of the cancer, they look at it, and they look at what molecules this cancer has, and then they pull out medications from the shelf that target those specific molecules. It's very directed therapy. So, if you take someone with breast cancer and another person with breast cancer, they're not getting the same treatment. With diseases of the brain, it's much more complicated. It's very complicated to study for several reasons. So one is a lot of the diseases are slow. Alzheimer's disease progresses over a decade. So if you want to study a treatment, it's going to take you years to figure out if it does anything. There's also a lot of variability. We could have 5 people with Alzheimer's disease. One person may progress over the course of 3 years. One person may stay the same for a while and then progress, 8 years later. And so when you give someone medication, we have no idea if they would have always progressed slowly, or did the medication actually do something. It's really hard to figure out. And the last piece is, I guess last of many, is it's really hard for us to actually figure out who to include in these trials. So actually, it turned out that when we do research trials for Alzheimer's disease, until pretty recently, about 20% of people that we would enroll did not actually turn out to have Alzheimer's disease. So you can imagine, if you want to know if a drug works for a disease and you're studying it on people who don't actually have it, you're not going to get a good result.
No, not at all. Where are we with regard to, if not a cure for Alzheimer's?
So we're in sort of a precarious place. So until now, the main idea has been what's called the amyloid theory. So, we know that Alzheimer's is defined by amyloid and tau proteins aggregating in the brain. And it turns out amyloid builds up about 10 to 15 years before symptoms ever start. So if someone has Alzheimer's disease starting in their 50s, they probably had amyloid all over their brain a decade earlier. Tau tends to build up more sort of along the timeline of the actual symptoms. And for that reason and a few other reasons, a lot of people have thought for a long time that if we could just get rid of amyloid, you could sort of prevent the horse from leaving the barn. You could cut the disease off in its tracks. And we've spent an enormous amount of money with drugs that target amyloid. Most of them didn't do it that effectively, although lately we have medications that actually do seem to clean up amyloid really effectively. But we haven't yet proven that method works. So the big thing in the news that people have been reading about is a medication called aducanumab that's made by a company called Biogen. And aducanumab, at least it used to be, it was sort of the most powerful amyloid cleaner around. It really did a good job of getting rid of amyloid. And so this company, they did 2 huge phase 3 trials of more than 1,000 people each. And they did an analysis part way and said, oh, actually, the medication isn't working, stop the trials. But you can imagine these are huge studies. So it takes a few months for the trials to really grind to a halt. So it takes about 3 months or so, the trial stops, and then they go back and analyze the data again. And they say, oh, actually, the drug worked. And the reason why they said that is they said, well, in one of these 2 studies, it didn't work. But if you look at the other one and you get rid of the people who were progressing really fast, and you only look at people who got a really high dose of the drug, then look, there's a little bit of a signal. So it was sort of a, hindsight 2020 should have been used to create a new theory that they would test. Instead, the company went to the FDA looking for approval. And the advisory committee said, this is not ready for prime time. But actually, the FDA approved it. And then there was sort of uproar. People are not, from a anecdotal perspective, people aren't really prescribing it. And then Medicare actually said they're not going to pay for it.
Yeah, that took care of that. Yeah, took care of that. Yeah, that's the most recent story. They got a little ahead of themselves.
Yes.
And got everybody excited. We have an aging population. Alzheimer's is not going to diminish by itself. So it must be some pretty exciting work out there, although very frustrating. I can imagine. What I asked you earlier about diagnosis. Tell me about brain imaging and how is it effective at all in your work?
So it's gotten pretty advanced. So CT scans are sort of the quick and dirty way to do brain imaging. Those are okay. MRI scans are even better. They give you a sense of what's big and what's small. And we know that in particular diseases, some structures tend to get small and some structures don't. And then what's the neatest in terms of Alzheimer's disease are these particular what's called PET scans. So, when we're talking about these amyloid and tau proteins, we now can have someone come into our office or come into the radiology suite. They give them a tracer. It goes through an IV. You get a tracer that sticks to amyloid, and then you take a picture of their brain and you can see where the amyloid aggregates are. And if someone has them, so you could actually take a picture and you can figure out if someone has amyloid aggregates in their brain. And the same thing with tau. So you could give them a tracer, it sticks to tau in their brain, and then you take a picture of where the tracer is, which is pretty remarkable. So now when we enroll trials in people, when we enroll trials for Alzheimer's disease drugs, we're able to actually figure out in living people with a really high sort of conviction rate that whether or not they have amyloid and tau. So we can be much more particular about who we enroll.
Sara Manning Peskin is our guest. She has written a book called A Molecule Away from Madness, Tales of the Hijacked Brain. You break down these rogue gene molecules into 4 categories. Can you give us a brief description of those 4?
Yeah, so I call them mutants, rebels, invaders, and evaders. The mutants are diseases that are caused by DNA mutations. That's things like Huntington's disease, particular forms of Alzheimer's disease. And then the rebels were diseases that are caused by proteins that take aim at the brain. And 2 of them are about stories of people whose immune systems essentially attack their brains and attack their spinal cords. One of those is the story of that woman who started to believe she was in The Walking Dead. And then the invaders are things that aren't supposed to be in the brain, but we bring them into our bodies and they get into the brain, something like a medication.
Mm-hmm.
And then the evaders are things that actually we need and we're missing them, something like a vitamin.
Uh-huh. Are any of them caused by the environment that we're living in?
So certainly the invaders. So the story that I chose in the invader section is actually about Abraham Lincoln, who we think that he used a medication called blue mass, and the main ingredient of blue mass is mercury. And so there are some folks who have this idea that he actually suffered from the effects of mercury toxicity, and that it caused him to be very volatile. And there's a quote from a colleague of his that apparently Lincoln told him that he was using blue mass, and then he had to stop after he got elected president because it was making him cross. And so that's the story they tell in the book. But environmental toxins would be in the same category. It's sort of things that are around us that get into the brain and they wreak havoc because they're not supposed to be there.
Yeah. Yeah. I just lost where I was going to go with this. Oh, what is the schizophrenia fit into what we're talking about here?
It's so interesting that you asked. I have to say, after I published the book, the biggest question that I get in terms of psychiatry is, what about schizophrenia? Where are we? And I have to admit, it's not my expertise. I have no idea where we are in terms of, how close are we to a molecular idea?
But we're not even looking at schizophrenia on a molecular level to find out.
I'm sure we are. And I have to say, it's sort of a little peripheral to my field. So I'm totally not up to date on the literature about it.
Yeah. And I guess in a kind of final sense here now, you don't study mental illness, do you? Your field is something different than mental illness, isn't it?
So, I often think of, a lot of what I do is sort of essentially therapy techniques. Yeah. So much of what I do is couples therapy, when people come in and one person has a, neurodegenerative disease and the other person doesn't, and, watching it play out in a partnership. Or a sort of family therapy, watching it, we have a 50-year-old with dementia. What does it look like with their kids? So in that way, there's a lot of therapy.
Yeah. But Sarah, who are you trying to help in that situation? The person who's not suffering from this so that they can deal with it?
But it has to be both. I mean, these diseases are not only affecting one person. And I think part of the issue is, this isn't a broken arm. You have to treat families. Yeah. And it will be better for the patient if things are better for the family too.
Yeah, what's devastating about this thing is the impact on everybody. In fact, in the terms of severe dementia or Alzheimer's disease, the sufferer of the disease is cut off from the suffering.
Yeah, 100% right. A lot of times it's the people who are around them that are suffering more.
Everybody else is actually the victims of Alzheimer's disease. The book is called A Molecule Away from Madness, The Hijacking of the Brain. Whenever a reviewer refers to something as a slim novel, I don't know whether they're, or a slim book, I don't know whether they're praising or not, but it's a great read, Sarah. This is, you really can, it's just a great read. You write so brilliantly, and you're talking about something which is beneficial to all of us. So if you got some time, folks, I'm telling you, I don't generally make a rule of recommending books. I think it's presumptuous to do that. Who knows what somebody wants to sit down and spend their time reading? I can recommend this one. It's a terrific read, not for the faint of heart, but it's hopeful. I mean, they're looking in the right place. Sarah, thank you so much. Can we have you back at some point?
I'd love to. Thanks so much. This was such a pleasure.
How long have you been in Philadelphia, incidentally?
Now, I guess 12 years.
And where are you from?
I grew up in Boston, but now I feel like a Philadelphian. I think maybe I've lived here long enough.
I lived and worked in Boston for a bunch of years, and I'm a native Philadelphian. I'll leave you with this, since we've got that in common. Someone once described the difference between Bostonians and Philadelphians as, in Philadelphia, and it's got to do with the Quaker underpinning, you don't draw attention, and everybody's comfortable being part of the tribe. And in Boston, everyone insists they're the chief. Okay, you might not agree. Anyway, welcome to Philadelphia. You're in Philadelphia now. 12 years makes it official. And the book is terrific. And I thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me. This is great.
Appreciate it a lot. Thank you guys for your time as well. You know where to find us, Facebook, all those other places. push the subscribe button, push the like button. You'll make my day. See you next time on the Behavioral Corner. Bye-bye.
Retreat Behavioral Health has proudly been serving the community for over 10 years. Here at Retreat, we believe in the power of connection and quality care. We offer comprehensive, holistic, and compassionate treatment from industry-leading experts. Call 855-802-6600 or visit us at www.retreatbehavioralhealth.com to begin your journey today.
That's it for now. And make us a habit, hanging out at the Behavioral Corner. And when we're not hanging, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter on the Behavioral Corner.